Today is workshop 2. We're going to be talking about bottom brackets, cranks, pedals, brakes, and the associated brake pads, of course. Here's our lovely bike that we're working on. First thing we're going to talk about is bottom brackets, and basically all that is this guy right here. It goes in the bottom bracket shell. Now on this bike, of course, we're dealing with donated things, donated bikes and whatnot. I could actually not get that bottom bracket out, but it works just fine. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So we're going to leave it in rather than trash the bike. We're just going to leave it in and use it. It'll be fine. But I'll explain to you how the bottom brackets work and how to install them and how all that stuff goes on, so you'll have an idea how to do it. So basically, there are, well, technically there's 3 kinds of bottom brackets. There's the old school, super old school, original, like one-piece crankset bottom bracket, which is, we throw them away because they're so useless. But it's basically the pedals and the crank arms that the pedals bolt onto, and the bottom bracket axle, and then subsequently the other side crank arm and pedal is all one piece. It ends up being a 3-piece bottom bracket, technically, but it's a 1-piece unit, so on top of it you have the crank arm coming up here, and on the other side the crank arm coming down there, and it's all one piece, and they're awful. So we don't use them. The other 2 kinds of bottom brackets that you'll encounter are these, right here. We have a standard 3-piece, which is 1 piece, and this is 1 piece, and then there would be another one that goes on the other side. All it is a cup and cone bearing system, compressed together by these, which are the bolts, essentially. This is a single-piece cartridge, sealed bottom bracket. It works exactly the same way as the 3-piece. You got your bearings go in the cup. The cup screws down onto the bottom bracket. You got a bottom bracket shell, which compresses against the cone, which is this guy, and you end up with a functioning bottom bracket. Like I said, these work exactly the same way, except they're sealed, so you can't mess. There's no way to adjust the compression of the bearings against the cups and the cones because it's just all together. This actually doesn't really do much except guide the bottom bracket on the other side of the shell. And to install them, it's pretty easy. You can imagine how it works. You screw it in one side, and then you take this one and you screw it in the other side. It's that easy. The 3-piece, you actually have to get the compression correct. Those are already done for you, and you just screw the whole thing in. With these, you actually have to get the compression right. So on this side, this would be the, I believe, the non-drive side. Yeah, this is the non-drive side.
Is the side away from the chain?
The side that does not have the cranks, the chain rings and the chain, the derailleurs. Yeah, so that would be this side. And then on the other side, you have these guys, which is essentially the same thing, except it has, you can see this one has a stop right here, and this one doesn't. And that is so you can screw a lock ring onto it. The threads go all the way out, and you screw this lock ring on there. And you screw the lock ring tight against the bottom bracket shell, and that keeps the whole thing from adjusting itself, loosening or tightening. Once you get it the correct compression, use the lock ring to lock it and keep it from changing. can be a little tedious to get right if you've never done it before. If you've done it a lot, it's not too difficult. And it works just like the headset, which you were here for, but you two were not. The headset is just a bearing system, a cup and cone bearing system. It works exactly the same way. With the bottom brackets, you can feel if it's too loose by just taking the cranks or the axle, this is the axle, and wiggling it. And if it has play, it's too loose. And if you can spin it and it's free, then it's fine. But if when you spin it you feel resistance in the bearings, like the bearings are grinding maybe, then it's too tight. That's how you tell whether it's too tight or too loose. Too loose if there's play, it's too tight if there's grinding.
When you're tightening it, do you tighten just, you put one side in and then just tighten the other side, or do you actually have to tighten both sides?
For a three-piece, so for example, this bike is a three-piece bottom bracket. You can see the lock ring over here, and the other side, the other cone or cup over here. This one, you always do this side first, and you just screw it in as far as it'll go, as tight as you can get it without, damage. Once this side's in all the way, you're going to take the other cup and you're going to screw it in, and you just keep screwing it in until eventually you'll feel it start to compress the bearings. And then once you feel it compress the bearings, you're going to back it off a little bit because you don't want friction going on. You don't want to be compressing the bearings so much that you're grinding them. You're going to back it off a little bit, then you screw the lock ring down and tighten it up against the bottom bracket shell, and it should be the correct compression when you do it that way. If it's too loose, all you're going to do is loosen the lock ring, then you're going to tighten the adjustment cup, and then tighten the lock ring again. If it's too tight, you're going to loosen the lock ring, then you're going to loosen the adjustment cup, and then tighten the lock ring. So the lock ring keeps it from adjusting. And you need to loosen it whenever you make an adjustment. And then what the lock ring is screwing down onto, which is the non-drive side cup, is what actually compresses against the bearings. You can see that little cup in there, the bearings fit in there, and then this compresses the bearings against the cone.
So what happens if it's too loose or too tight?
If it's too loose, you'll feel there'll be play and it'll wiggle, and so you can get stuff down in there, or you can get space between the bearings, maybe you'll catch a bearing. You'll get less power out of the cranking of the system, because when you pedal, if when you pedal all of your energy goes into turning the crank, you're going to get more energy out of it, rather than if when you pedal some of that energy, if it's loose, some of that energy is going to be lost by wiggling the crank, right? So you're trying to conserve as much energy as you can by not having any wiggling going on, which will eat up some energy, and also not having any grinding going on, which will also eat up some energy, because that's a frictional force that you have to then overcome. You can also grind your bearings down that way. I've never seen it happen or heard of it happening, but I assume that it's probably possible if the compression is not right and you're cranking really hard. You might blow a bearing through the bottom bracket shell. Don't know. It's possible. Probably not enough force going on there to make that happen, but it could seize up for sure. You could get a bearing grind and seize up against something else that's in there. Probably pretty rare, but I've never seen that happen. So, bottom brackets, there you have it. Pretty easy. I wish I could have gotten it out so I could actually demonstrate putting one in, but I didn't want to destroy it trying to do that, because it is a functioning bottom bracket. It's the correct compression. So. The next thing I was going to talk about were cranks. So cranks are made up of a lot of stuff. We have, how are you doing?
How you doing?
You here for the class?
Yeah.
Cool, have a seat. The crank set itself is made up of a few things. We have the crank arms, of course the non-drive side crank arm, and the drive side crank arm. And then we have the chain rings, which on this particular crank set, they are not removable. When you get into nicer crank sets, they are. You can replace the chain rings. I just replaced the chain rings on my bikes. It's really not that difficult to do. So the chain rings are held onto the crank. You start off with usually the drive side crank will have crank arm and then also a spindle of sorts. And then you find the different, it's called bolt circle diameters. This is the tool that you use to figure that out. And you just line up the bolt circles with the holes in the crank arm, and you drop one of these chain ring bolts down in there and screw it into a chain ring bolt nut. You need a special tool to do it. This one right here, got this funny little apparatus. So, crank sets. I talked about the single piece crank set before with the really annoying bottom brackets and the big giant S thing that's really difficult to feed through the bottom bracket shell. Those, the crank arms are part of the axle. It's actually one big piece. And then lots of different styles of crank arm attachments. The way this goes on is pretty simple. This particular one is what's called square taper. So you can see it's square, but it's also taper, so it's thicker back here than it is down here in the front. And that just helps it stay on better. And it's as easy as putting it on there and then screwing the axle bolt in. And crank it down pretty hard because it will actually pull it. It will suck it down into there. So you have to crank it pretty hard to get it to go. A couple different kinds. There's one called ISIS that's a star. It's got like 8 little splines. Shimano has a spline system. I forget what it's called. Star octagonal or something. And if you have one of those other different kinds, the square taper is pretty standard, but if you have an ISIS style, then you have to have a crank that matches it. And it'll be the axle itself that has the different style, and then you need the crank that'll fit it and match onto it. ISIS was really popular in cyclocross bikes for a while.